Hello all, and welcome to my poster presentation. My name is Claire Dulaney, I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Outreach Archivist in Archives and Special Collections at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. In keeping with the conference theme of Suffrage Legacies, Civil Rights, Political Activism, and Archives, I will share my experience in curating a department exhibit in this presentation titled Votes for Women, More Than the 19th Amendment, Exhibit Creation, Outreach, and Reflection. My primary goal with this exhibit was to tell a succinct and engaging history of women's suffrage using the documents I had at my disposal. That might be an obvious point, but from there I identified 3 areas of focus for this display. First, I wanted to illustrate that the suffrage movement neither began nor ended in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Rather, it is one point in the long historical narrative arc. Second, I wanted to very clearly and explicitly acknowledge the gaps in our collection regarding the history of women of color, Black, immigrant, Indigenous, and other non-white or minority suffragists. Finally, I wanted to incorporate material in our collection that were relevant but may not get a lot of attention from either teaching or display. Through this exhibit and the archival items selected, I wanted the viewer to grapple with the very common tendency to pigeonhole historical moments and think about them within the larger context. Through the items that I displayed, I hope that the viewers would see that larger historical arc, making their own connections to these moments in history, and have their interest piqued to visit archives and special collections to engage on a more personal level with the items. Nebraska is an interesting case study for the history of the long suffrage movement, as it was an early battleground for women's suffrage and at one point poised to be one of the first states to allow women the right to vote. Amelia Bloomer was an early advocate for women's right to vote, starting in the 1850s before the territory of Nebraska became a state. Both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke at voter events in Omaha, and Nebraska would see 2 suffrage amendments fail state vote before the federal 19th Amendment was passed. I wanted to show this early history as both the foundation for the 19th Amendment work, but also the work done by the Equal Rights Amendment, the Me Too movement, and the National Organization for Women to forward reproductive health, financial independence, and other forms of autonomy for women as part of the narrative thread and not isolated historical monoliths. One method to accomplish this was to put varied events in conversation with one another. Newspapers, pamphlets, and posters are great at illustrating this. I put materials from the turn of the century, such as an 1895 copy of the Women's Tribune, a Nebraska paper that connected suffrage, feminism, and the frontier woman, in the same space as a 2020 COVID poster created by a local Omaha company, which features a masked woman in a stance of resilience and communal power. Similarly, I placed a pamphlet supporting the Shepherd-Towner Act of 1920, which focused on maternal and infant health in dialogue with a zine about women's reproductive rights, as well as assorted National Organization for Women financial and health materials. Where I intentionally chose to jar the audience visually and intellectually was one section of the display that was completely empty of materials and blacked out with a cloth. The only thing on the shelf was an acknowledgement that our collections and the traditional history of the suffrage movement ignores or suppresses the accomplishments of Black, Indigenous, immigrant, LGBTQ+, and women of color. It was important that this was explicitly stated, as it is so easy to think of the suffrage movement as centered on the white, middle-class silent sentinels outside the White House. In reflecting on this work, I am happy with the way that Votes for Women, More Than the 19th Amendment was a visual timeline of Nebraskan women's role in working towards political equality before the law. This exhibit illustrates that suffrage activity did not manifest only in 1920 with the fight for the presidential vote. Suffrage focuses on local elections, creating legislation, and protesting for reproductive freedom and labor protections. The Equal Rights Amendment, political and community work, the Me Too movement, and conversations during COVID are all active legacies of the 19th century suffrage work. This story is made more robust by including student voices, municipal and county documents, and publications written by women throughout the decades. Here at UNO Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, the collecting and sharing of these activities continues in increasingly inclusive and ethical ways. Thank you so much.